because everybody realizes that we have this sort of innate, almost godlike potential as humans to reason and to create and to do all these things. But then we have this bizarre paradox where we get sick and old and die. And that something is wrong. Like, everybody knows this. Every single ancient mythology realizes that this is a contradiction.
Why can't the RK just wave his hand and solve the problems of death and human suffering?
Because of this whole free will thing. So, if you want God, what a lot of people say is that God created the world in love. He wanted to, the Trinity is full of love. God creates in love. He wants us to be in loving communion with each other in Him. But you can't have love if I put a gun to your head. If I put a gun to your head and say, you're going to be my best friend now, and you're like, this is not real friendship. It's coercion. So if you're forced to do something, then it's not real. It has to be free. And so God has to give us free will and really allow us to choose in order for love to even be possible at all. So the problems of death and evil, well, let's say evil to start, if you're not free to do evil, you're not free. Just end of the story. You have to be truly free. You have to be free to do evil. But that's the necessary prerequisite to being free to love. And death is kind of a different concept. It's the idea is if Christ, if the RK is life itself, the analogy I use is the power strip, and the life itself is the wall socket, and you plug the power strip into it, you have power. But if you pull it out, then the power goes out. It's like you're not the RK. You don't have life in yourself. And so when mankind unplugs from God, then we die. That's kind of what the Genesis, one of the things that the Genesis account is about.
And then how does I know this is not the correct way to say it, and feel free to correct me. How does the existence of evil prove God?
Well, many people have pointed out. So there's this old philosophy problem called the problem of evil, and it states that the idea is that the existence of evil is, you can't both believe that evil exists, and it's hard not to, and also believe that there's a loving, omnipotent God. Because if He loved us, He wouldn't want to see us suffer, and if He's omnipotent, He could do something about it. And so therefore, if you have either God doesn't exist, or He doesn't really love us, or He's incompetent. That's why there's evil in the world. And this has been refuted so many times. I just don't know why it continues to hang on. It's refuted very easily with the free will defense. But the twist that you're alluding to, that some philosophers have taken to it, is that, well, actually, the existence of evil proves that there's a God, or at least it suggests strongly that there's a missing element that can be filled by God. Because if you say something is evil, you're actually making a weird claim. You can say you don't like something. You can say something is counterproductive to your agenda, whatever you want. You can say, oh, that causes suffering. It's like, well, so what? It's like, well, I don't want to suffer. It's like, okay, like you haven't yet gotten at evil, because what we mean by evil is something that violates the cosmic moral law, you could call it, of the universe. So the idea of evil, not merely suffering, assumes good, and both assume a absolute standard, cosmic absolute standard for morality. Now, why would you assume something like that? It's like, well, it sounds like we're talking about God. It sounds like we're talking about a moral world that's transcendent and absolute of our material circumstances. Absolute and transcendent of our material circumstances. So that seems to imply at least some kind of moral lawgiver, right? Now, you say, well, then therefore not necessarily the Christian God. And it's like, okay, sure. But the point is, if you really want to say something is evil, and if you want to say something is good in a moral sense, then absolute morality has to be on the table. Well, absolute morality is what you're assuming, and then God is definitely on the table.
It has to be an absolute morality giver.
Yeah.
Yes, in some sense.
Yep.
So, going back to what you just said about the fall. So the part of the story of Genesis is that there's this disconnect from God, and that causes death. Um, this is correct me if you think this is a bad way to say it. Christianity is the solution to that. Was that a fair thing to say?
To death?
To the disconnection from God, right? Human beings disconnect from God in the fall, and then maybe I shouldn't say Christianity. Christ is the solution to that reconnection to be able to happen,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, in the absence of me being aware of Christianity, let's say I'm in the Amazon remoteness and the missionary hasn't come to me yet, or this is pre-Christian world and pagan wherever. Do you think that regardless of the religious worldview, that it's observable that human beings have disconnected from the arche? Like, can the argument
That's
be
not.
made without Christ coming and saying, "Hey, guys, this is what happened"?
Yeah, it's not. That's not where I thought you were gonna go. This is cool. Uh, yeah, because everybody gets sick and dies. I mean, everybody knows like something is wrong with the world. Every single culture has some kind of origin of evil story because everybody realizes that we have this sort of innate, almost godlike potential as humans to reason and to create and to do all these things. But then we have this bizarre paradox where we get sick and old and die. And that something is wrong. Like everybody knows this. Every single ancient mythology realizes that this is a contradiction. John Zizioulas, the late bishop of Pergamon, said that the fall results in the ultimate contradiction, the dying being, right?
Dying
Where
being, because
being,
if I was dying, how would I be being?
right? It's just a bizarre thing, and so you know everybody knows there's a problem, and all these different worldviews have come to solve the problem in one way or another. And Christianity offers a solution. It's not that like without Christianity, I wouldn't know that there was a problem. Like there's a problem, because death is horrible, and that there's evil. One philosopher put it this way. He said, "We know." He was trying to get away from all the arguments, and he just kind of stepped back and he said, "Listen, we know that the moral world exists in the same way that we know the physical world exists because we bump into it all the time. You have a conscience that nags you. You do bad stuff and you see evil in the world, and you're like, we have this real our experience of a moral reality is very obvious. And it doesn't matter that it doesn't fit into the sort of narrow empirical methodology that modern secular science wants to insist on, because most things don't. And in fact, all the things that have meaning in life don't fit into that. So you can either be a bad scientist and throw out 90% of the data of every single culture and human experience, or you can say, you know what, there's something going on here. There's a moral perception that we all have, and we know that something is wrong. C.S. Lewis pointed this out in Mere Christianity. He said there's two funny things about humanity, is that A, we all know that there's a moral law. Every single major culture has a set of morality. And B, everyone's aware that we don't really hold up to it. We have it, and we don't do it really. Like, sort of. And he said those two awarenesses have gone together throughout all these cultures. And he's like, isn't that weird?
Yeah, and then I'm going to expand on this question. And I've been waiting to ask the appropriate person this question because I've been sitting on this for a while. So if I take a kind of a world history step back and I say, okay, here's all this stuff that's happened since, we'll say, 5000 BC, and all these different religions and all these different places. And as I'm a pattern junkie, I guess, for lack of a better term. I'm obsessed with finding patterns and things. A pattern that think I've observed is that religions really seem to fall into two different categories, which I'm about to explain. The first category is you're here one time, you got one shot, you're going to be judged on that one shot based on how you acted in this one shot that you have for the afterlife. The other category is you have an infinite number of shots, the endless cycle of rebirth. And not only do you have an infinite number of shots, they all suck. Right? It's suffering because no matter how, like, okay, you're going to be judged when you die, and you're going to be reborn based on what you did in the previous life. And even if you nailed it in the previous life, and you get reborn better, and then you get reborn better, and you get reborn better, at some point you're going to screw up, and you're going to go back down to the bottom, and it's going to be horrible. Then you're going to come back up, and then it's just a cycle that never ends. So there's even this like futility toward the idea of, having a certain, I mean, obviously I'm referring to the Hinduistic tradition here, having a certain karma, because no matter how good you are, you're still going to be stuck in this endless zoo loop, right? And the various Hinduistic religions, and I include Buddhism and Sikhism, for example, under this broad umbrella, because both of those attempt to address the issue of like this infinite suffering, right? And the Buddhism solution is like, how do we just, or at least the early Buddhist solution is, how do we just snuff ourselves out? I learned that is that nirvana literally means to extinguish or to snuff out. How do we snuff ourselves out of this infinite suffering of existence? And if I look at these two as kind of like two banquet tables, and I guess a small thing, there's kind of a third banquet table, which is paganism, and I don't really include it because there isn't really a pagan tradition that attempts to have a cohesive understanding of everything that's going on, right? So if I look at these two banquet tables, Christianity has a solution to the first table. However, this works on the assumption is you got one shot, one time. Why, if I'm trying to figure out how I'm gonna not understand but participate in reality, what worldview I want, why should I drift toward that? You got one shot, one time versus you got an infinite number of shots.
Slight correction is that paganism, if you mean by like Western types of paganism, Greco-Roman,
I mean
Egyptian,
anything
whatever.
Pre main world religion.
Yeah, I mean they would take either position, right? There were pagans who believed in reincarnation. There were pagans who did not. Everyone went to Hades if you're a Greek, etc. So it just kind of paganism is there's just type. They're both paganism, I think. Yeah. So why should I pick one? It's like, well,
let me be a little more clear. Christianity offers a solution to one of those tables. What if I'm at the other table?
Yeah, well, so the answer is like, well, the thing you want is what's true. I mean, that's the main thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question, so the sort of the preceding question is, well, which of these is the actual state of things?
Correct.
Are we reborn or not? And I think it's really interesting that, well, okay, so let me say this. The early Christian take, as I mentioned, was not that the pagan deities did not exist. They accepted the existence basically of all these creatures. What they said was they are
demons.
They're demons. They're fallen gods. So I don't know what you know about this, but the idea is that when God made the world, he put certain angelic beings, if you want to call them that, I'll just call them gods, to steward over different nations. And I think this is the subtext of what's going on in Babel, which is that when God divides the nations, he assigns them an angel, a deity, and that deity gives them their language. This is what Origin says. He gives them their language, he gives them their customs, and he's supposed to watch over them. And God chooses Israel to personally watch over himself because humanity is in its infancy. So we all need these different creatures to, like, we need a divine patron to watch over us. So God takes Israel for himself and he assigns, there's something in Deuteronomy that says, mankind was divided according to the number of the sons of God. He's talking about the gods, the angels. So the Christian narrative is that Every single one of those patrons went bad and had his own or her own personal fall
Every
and
single one.
create every single one. That's the
Okay.
idea. And created, well, as the ones that were assigned to humans, to human tribes and nations. And they created the pagan religions as an elaborate falsification so that to trap their individual people group in the worship of their religion. So the gods were hungry for sacrifices. They do eat them in some capacity. Moloch wants babies for whatever reason. It's like, so they created these essentially. So the pagan religions are false in the sense that they are elaborate propaganda narratives that do revisionism on what actually happened to entrap the people group that they're in charge of patroning, but then they get all the sacrifices and worship and rule. So this makes a lot of sense as a unifying theory for all world religions. That's kind of why I like Christianity from this kind of comparative religions perspective, is it offers a unified field theory for religion, if you want to put it that way. Because if you look at all these religions, so many of them have this narrative, like I'll pick on the Greeks, for example. The Olympians, their parents were the Titans, and they screwed everything up. And there was a war in heaven, and we overthrew them, and now we're going to rule the world properly. And like, doesn't that actually sound like a revisionism of the actual narrative, which is that the gods fell and the arche cast them down from heaven, and wasn't, it's not Saturn was mean and we overthrew him. And this is the narrative of people who lost trying to do revisionism to trick their human patrons. Okay, so why am I saying all this? Because if you accept this or
And then,
find flaws,
sorry, just to make sure I'm
yeah,
coming up to speed here. So if we say Saturn is the archetype of the arche, he's an arche twice there. The archetype of the arche, and he supposedly devours his own children, and Zeus comes by and or his wife pretends that Zeus is a rock when he's born, so he eats the rock instead of Zeus. Zeus goes up, beats him up, and the kids come out and they take over. Right? That would be a propaganda spin of Zeus and his siblings going, we just overthrew our dad, and how do we make it look good?
basically,
Yeah.
except according to the Christian narrative, they didn't win the war in heaven. They lost the war in
So they
heaven
got
to the
cast down.
arche. Right. And so they get cast down, and what do? Well, they come up with a narrative to show why to put them in a better light and to give legitimacy to their rule over the humans. So if you accept this kind of unified field theory or you find it plausible, then we can, like the early church did, then you can go look at the reincarnation thing. And when I studied Buddhism with Charles Jones, who's a I guess he's kind of a big deal Buddhist scholar at Catholic University of America. And he pointed out that because when you have that giant wheel, there's this like old pictogram thing of
The
like
wheel with
Buddhist
the spokes on it.
iconography. Well, it's got the wheel and it's got all the stages of reincarnation around it. I'm sure it has a name that I've forgotten, but it's basically like a Buddhist iconography of the cosmos and how it shows the cycles of rebirth and it shows all this complicated cosmology stuff. But holding the wheel is, oh, I want to pull this up here if you don't mind. Okay, so this is the Buddhist wheel of life. It shows all these stages of reincarnation. There's parts in the middle here, and then there's the three animals. There's all this stuff, and then on the outside there's all these scenes from life and how life and death are all related and blah blah blah. So this is an important, the Buddhist wheel of life, very famous, many versions of it. You see it in Buddhist monasteries, all this cool stuff. Well, guess what else is going on?
Somebody's holding it, as you just mentioned.
Who is this?
Someone with
Well,
skulls on her head.
this is Mara. Mara is the god of time, death, and illusion. That looks like a demon to me. So it's a weird thing that I've noticed doing comparative religion is that these demons who have fallen, they really have this desire to be worshipped and known. They just crave it. You can see all his weird feet and everything out here.
Mm-hmm.
So Mara He rules the wheel. That's what this image is telling me. Now, Buddhist people can come in here and say, well, actually, blah, blah, blah. I don't care about that for right now. I want to zoom out a little bit. What's the big picture here? Is that this thing that you're trapped in, who's running it? It's the devil. The devil has you trapped in an illusion, time, death, and illusion. So, to answer your question, it's like, well, is reincarnation true? Is it really happen? And I look at this and I'm like, seems like seems like a scam, like at a very basic level.
Well, and to that point, I left this out when I was framing the question. In the description of samsara, right, this endless cycle of rebirth, where I was listening to a teaching company lecture on Hinduism, right, and this professor was trying to get the point across, because sometimes when Westerners, or call the Christian or monotheistic side of things, hears about reincarnation, it sounds like, ooh, I get another shot, right? They see it as something kind of positive, versus the suffering nature of it. And the point that this professor was trying to make is that apparently in some Hindu Sanskrit story somewhere, there's this kid talking to, I think, the god Indra. And at some point, the kid starts crying. And Indra's like, what are you crying about? And the kid points down at the ground. He says, you see these ants walking across the ground right now? He goes, yeah. He says, each one of these ants has been Indra 100 million times.
Mm.
And that, again, this idea, like at some point, even the gods are subject to this, going in and out of the cycle. And I think that really, like, this eternity of you're stuck in this cycle, and no matter how good you have it, you could even become a god. At some point, you're gonna be stuck going back down into the cycle. Well, that sounds like hell to me.
Correct. Yeah, and I think that
Right?
yeah, absolutely. And so it's like it's not. You have to zoom out a little bit from the particulars.
Yeah.
The Far Eastern Indian subcontinent version of the cosmos is sort of the same as the Greek one, in the sense that we are all trapped. It could be trapped in Hades, you could be trapped in samsara, but like man is trapped and subjugated. He is under lock and key to death. And that's why in the Revelation, Christ says that he's conquered death, and that he now holds the keys to death, because death was a prison and a jail. And if you just squint your eyes a little bit, it's easy to see samsara as basically saying the same thing. Because, like you said, it's not that you get many shots; it's that you're stuck. It doesn't matter like in what way you're stuck, how you want to
Right.
conceive of
Well,
that.
and then you could be the best saint ever and get the best reward ever, but it's temporary, and at some point you're going to screw up, and you're back down where you were before.
Well, the way Dr. Charles Jones explained it to us was that when the belief is that when you finally got reincarnated as a god in the highest of heavens, you basically just got to party for thousands of years. You drank and
Or
had
millions of
orgies.
years, yeah.
Yeah, you drank and you had orgies and whatever, and you just lived this life of hedonist pleasure for millions of years. But then you used up all your karma, and so you got reborn in hell. And so then you have to start the cycle all the way back up. So you like hell is a place of suffering and torment, and you go all the way back up and you go all the way back down. And so the takeaway from that is like the pleasure is meaningless too. It doesn't matter.
Hmm.
Like there's suffering and there's pleasure, and they oscillate. There's life and death. Like none of these things have any meaning ultimately.
And like going back more to my original question of the two banquet tables, what it seems to me these religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, Sikhism, whatever, is they all have their different way of saying this is how we disconnect from this. And like that, this is why I've never really been a fan of Buddhism. And I know Buddhism, like when you have the Theravada and it turns into the Mahayana, then it turns into what is the Vajrayana. They have a completely different interpretation of all these things. But going back to the original guys, the story, as I understand it, is that there's this hell that we're in, for lack of a better term, and you're stuck in it no matter how you act. Like you said, it's all meaningless. So the goal is to snuff yourself out. basically to annihilate yourself. Which, I mean, even that sounds awful. Right? I mean, it's an awful situation with an awful answer. And
Yeah, I think
yeah,
somebody asked the
I liked
Buddha.
your answer that it's just, here's a demon holding it all together, and they even show that. What were you gonna say?
Yes, yes. I was just say the Buddha, I think, was asked one time. There's like 800 million apocryphal. Who knows if he said this kind of stories? But
Right.
one time was they're like, well, when you achieve nirvana, do you exist afterward or do you not exist afterward? And he never answered. He just sat there in silence. And the guy asked him again. He doesn't say anything. He leaves. He's mad. And the disciple asked the Buddha, why didn't you say anything? And he said, well, it was the wrong question. And the point being something like neither existence, it's a category error. Like when
Right.
you achieve nirvana, you don't exist and you don't not exist. It's just something else that we can't even conceive of. And to me, this is actually the most cosmic despairing thing you could say, because you're saying something like every single thing that you experience in samsara is fake. Even the concept of your own existence and
Right.
personhood, there's no truth to any of it. And that's really more what you're kind of dealing with when you face one of these religions that's ruled by Mara, let's say. And the Christian answer is to the contrary. God makes everything good. And you know that intuitively because you have these moments of joy in your life. I'm not talking about pleasure. I'm talking about we've all had these kind of transcendent moments of joy and beauty where you feel like you're touching something real and then it passes. And so the Christian answer is that's not fake. That's a foretaste of what's coming. And this is the whole emphasis of Orthodox liturgy and the Eucharist and everything, is that real life is coming. You can get hints of it. Those hints are breadcrumbs leading you along toward reality itself. And we're a good world that's fallen. That's all. And it needs to be redeemed. Whereas Buddhism, these other religions, they're like, it's all fake. Even your concept of being. And that's like, okay.
Everyone, please like, comment, and subscribe to help us grow this channel. I think we cover a lot of good stuff. We're covering ideas that you're not hearing anywhere else. Economic ideas, historical ideas, systematic politics ideas you're not hearing anywhere else.